In 1968, a researcher at Harvard gave a group of elementary school teachers a list of names. The names were fake. The children on that list were chosen at random. The teachers were told something else entirely. They were told those students were about to intellectually bloom. By the end of the school year, those randomly selected children had gained significantly more IQ points than their classmates. Nobody had changed the curriculum. Nobody had given those kids extra resources. The only thing that changed was what the teachers believed about them. This is the Pygmalion Effect. It is named after a figure from Greek mythology, a sculptor who carved a statue so perfect that he fell in love with it. The goddess Aphrodite brought the statue to life. The sculptor had wanted it to be real badly enough, and eventually it was. The psychologists who named this phenomenon were not being poetic. They were making a precise point. Expectations have a physical mechanism. They move through behavior, through tone, through the small decisions people make every day, and they land in the minds of the people being observed. Then those people perform accordingly. Robert Rosenthal was the psychologist who ran the classroom study. His partner was a principal named Lenore Jacobson. The school was Spruce Elementary in California. They administered a standard IQ test to every student in the building, then told the teachers the test was something else. They called it a measure of intellectual blooming potential. They handed each teacher a list of names, roughly 20% of the student body, and described those students as sitting on the edge of a major cognitive leap. In reality, Rosenthal had pulled the names at random from a hat. There was no test. There was no special potential. There were just children. 8 months later, Rosenthal and Jacobson returned and tested every student again. The results were not subtle. The children on the fake list outperformed their peers on measured IQ gains. The effect was strongest in the youngest grades, first and second, where gaps of 10 and 15 points separated the labeled children from those who had not been labeled at all. The teachers had not been instructed to treat these students differently. Nobody had told them to pay more attention or assign harder work, but they did. They called on those students more. They gave them more time to answer. When those students gave a wrong answer, the teachers pushed them further rather than moving on. The expectations had written themselves into 100 tiny daily decisions that no teacher could have listed from memory. Rosenthal spent years afterward trying to understand the mechanism. He identified 4 specific channels through which expectations travel. Climate was the first. Teachers were warmer toward the students they believed in. Their facial expressions, their body language, the tone underneath the words, all communicated something the students could read without being told. Input was the second channel. High expectation students were given harder material. They were taught more because the teacher assumed they could absorb more. Response opportunity was the third. Those students were called on more frequently and given longer windows to work through an answer. Feedback was the fourth. When a high expectation student answered correctly, the praise was more detailed. When they answered incorrectly, they were more likely to be coached toward the right answer rather than bypassed. What made these 4 channels particularly powerful was their cumulative effect over time. A single interaction meant little, but multiplied across hundreds of school days, across dozens of subjects and moments of learning, the channels carved distinct pathways in how students saw themselves. The students who received more climate, more input, more response opportunity, and more detailed feedback began to internalize a different narrative about their own abilities. They participated more confidently. They persisted longer when facing difficult problems. They saw themselves as capable learners. The expectations had become self-reinforcing, each day building on the previous day's accumulated advantage. None of these behaviors required conscious intent. That was what made Rosenthal uneasy about the findings. The teachers at Spruce Elementary were not trying to disadvantage any student. Most of them would have said, if asked, that they treated everyone fairly, but the expectations were already operating below the level of deliberate choice. They had become the water the classroom swam in. The students who were not on the list were not treated badly. They were simply treated as ordinary, and ordinary, it turned out, was its own kind of ceiling. The name Pygmalion had been applied to this general idea before Rosenthal and Jacobson published their study. George Bernard Shaw had used it for a play about a phonetics professor who transforms a Cockney flower seller into a woman who could pass for a duchess. Shaw's point was about class and language, but beneath the surface of the play was the same mechanism. Henry Higgins expected Eliza Doolittle to become something, and he structured every interaction around that expectation, and she did. The sociologist Robert Merton had named this pattern the self-fulfilling prophecy 20 years before the classroom study was published. A belief that is false at the moment it is formed can become true through the actions it generates. Merton called it one of the most consequential and least examined forces in social life. Rosenthal's work was not without critics. In the decades following publication, researchers who tried to replicate the classroom findings got inconsistent results. Some studies produced large effects. Others found almost nothing. The original methodology was scrutinized and found to have weaknesses. The sample sizes were small in certain grades. The IQ tests used were not the most reliable instruments available. Statisticians argued about the significance thresholds. The debate continued for years, but across 345 follow-up studies that Rosenthal later analyzed alongside Harvard statistician Donald Rubin, conducted in classrooms, military training facilities, courtrooms, and hospitals, the effect appeared consistently enough that dismissing it entirely became difficult to justify. The magnitude varied, the direction almost never did. In management research, the Pygmalion Effect found some of its most striking applications. Studies conducted inside military training programs showed that when instructors were told certain recruits had exceptional potential, those recruits outperformed identical peers whose instructors had been given no such information. The recruits did not know they had been labeled. The instructors did not know the labels were fabricated. The performance gap emerged anyway. Business researchers found parallel results in sales teams and corporate training programs. When managers held higher expectations of their direct reports, those employees consistently outperformed equivalent employees managed by people who held lower expectations. The effect compounded over time. High expectation employees received more challenging assignments, which built more skills, which produced better performance, which reinforced the original belief. The inverse had a name too. Rosenthal and his collaborators called it the Golem Effect, drawn from Jewish folklore and its creature of clay, animated without a soul. Where the Pygmalion Effect describes performance rising to meet positive expectations, the Golem Effect describes performance falling to meet negative ones. Students labeled as low ability received less time, harder to read feedback, and fewer second chances. Over months and years, those students moved toward the performance their teachers had already imagined for them. The labeling became biography. Neither teachers nor managers were typically aware this was happening. The expectations were invisible to the people carrying them. The myth of Pygmalion, in its original form, ended with the statue walking out of the workshop and into the world. What it did next, the myth did not specify. Rosenthal's research stopped at the school year, at the training cycle, at the performance review. What the data kept showing was that the statue was always moving before the sculptor realized it had begun.